Okay, so today we're starting Masechet Megillah, and for the most part this Masechet deals with the laws of reading the Megillah and all the other laws of Purim, but since it deals with reading the Megillah, it will get into the general laws of Kriyat Torah, and then since for the most part Kriyat Megillah takes place in Yeshua, we'll deal with the laws of BAYT Knesset and selling a BAYT Knesset and things of that effect. So the first Mishnah starts off by looking at the fact that there was a takana at some point that was established that small villagers could advance the day of reading the Megillah. And so we'll deal with all of that in the Mishnah, and then the Mishnah will explain why this came into being. So the Mishnah starts off, Megillah nikret b'yud aleph b'yud bet b'yud gimel b'yud dalet b'tet vav lo pachot v'lo yoter. That the reading of the Megillah could take place on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th of Adar, not before that and not afterwards. So now the Mishnah will illustrate how each of those days come into effect. So krachim amukafin chomami mot Yoshua binun korim betet vav and kvarim vayarot dolot korim b'yudalet. So as Rashi explains, generally speaking, as a general rule, the idea is that a city that was walled from the time of Yoshua binun reads the Megillah on the 15th of Adar, which we call Shushan Purim, and villages and towns read it on the 14th. However, as the Mishnah says, with the provision that tiny small towns can advance the reading of the Megillah to the day of a gathering. Now, as Rashi explains, the day of gathering was either a Monday or a Thursday, where the courts would be open in the larger cities for villagers to come and seek justice. So since they tended to be there on those days in any case, so we didn't wish to have them, as Rashi goes on to explain, have to come back. If, say, Purim was a Tuesday or a Wednesday or Friday or something to that effect, have to come back to the larger cities again because they didn't either have a minyan or they didn't have a Baal Koreh, and also they needed to provide provisions, foodstuffs to the people in the cities to celebrate Purim. So therefore, if they had to come on their regular Monday and Thursday and then come back again to hear the Megillah on Purim itself, they wouldn't have enough time to do all the things that they needed to be able to do, to be able to support Purim in the big city. So therefore we gave them the allowance to advance the reading to the Monday or Thursday that's closest to Purim. So now the Gemara is going to go through a calculus of how that works out depending on what day of the week Purim is. So Ketzad, so how does this translate? Chaliyot Yudalet B'Sheni Kfarim Vayarot Dolot Korim Bo Bayom Umukafot Choma L'Machar. If Purim turns out to be on Monday, then the small villages and the cities will all read the Megillah together on that day, and the ones that are walled cities will read it the following day. Chaliyot B'Shlishi or B'Rvi'i, if Purim is Tuesday or Wednesday, however, Kfarim Makdimim L'Yom HaKnisa, then the small villages will advance Purim to the day of gathering, which is Monday, so then it will be the 12th or the 13th. Vayarot dolot korim bo bayom, and the larger cities will read it on Yud Dalet, and mukafot choma lemachar, and then the walled cities will read it on Shushan Purim. Chaliyot bechamishi, if it's on Thursday, then once again we don't have any issues. Kfarim vayarot dolot korim bo bayom, mukafot choma lemachar, then everybody will read Thursday and Friday. Chaliyot Erev Shabbat, if Purim is on Erev Shabbat, so Kfarim Makdimin L'Yom Knisa, the little villages would advance Purim by a day to Thursday. Vayarot Dolot Mukafot Choma Korim Bo Bayom, and here it's different. The all of the cities, including the walled cities, would read it on Friday, because we don't read the Megillah on Shabbat, and that's what happens when we have a Purim Mishulash, even in today's day and age. Chaliyot b'Shabbat. Now, we can't have that happen in our calendar, that Yud Dalet is on Shabbat, but if it were to fall on Shabbat, Kfarim v'Ayarot Dolot Makdimim b'Korim l'Yom HaKnisa. So in this case, we don't split them. We say that since the larger cities are going to have to move up the day of Purim in any case, so then they back it up to Thursday and celebrate it on the same day as the small villages. So since they're having to move Purim, the larger cities, they don't move it to Friday, they move it back to Thursday, so that at least there'd be some achdut of who's reading Thursday. And Mukafot Choma Machar, and then the walled cities will read it on Sunday. Chaliyot Achar Shabbat, if Purim comes out on Sunday, which is very common, Kfarim Makdimim Yom HaKnisa, then the little villages would move it up to the gathering day, which is Thursday, so that's how we get Yud Aleph. Vayarot Dolot Korim Bo Bayom, and the larger cities would read on Sunday, Mukafot Choma Machar, and the walled cities on Monday. Okay, so now the Gemara wants to understand how we managed to come up with this arrangement, because the Megillah doesn't suggest it. It only suggests that there's 2 days of Purim, right? So that's the Gemara asks right away. Megillah nikret b'Yud Aleph minalan. How do you get that the Megillah is written on is read on the 11th? So he says, Minalan kidebayinan lemeimar lekaman chachamim ekilu ala kvarim liyot makdimim liyom haknisa kedei shisapku mayim umazon lachem shebekrachem. He said, how did we get that? It's like we've been suggesting, and as we'll explain, that the Chachamim gave a license to the small villages because they have to provide food for Purim in the larger cities, so then they can't manage everything if they also have to come to the larger cities to hear the Megillah, so therefore they allowed them to advance it and do it earlier. So he says, I'm not asking you how this came about. I'm asking you, why do we allow this, period? Michte kulu anshe knesset agdola takninu diisal kadat anshe knesset agdola yudal v'teva takunu to rabbanan ve'akri takanta de ketinu anshe knesset agdola. It must be that the original dates of the 14th and the 15th were established by Anshe Knesset Agdolah, because if you're saying that somebody else established those dates, then you're suggesting that somebody must have come along later and decided that we could also add the 11th, 12th, and 13th. But we know for a fact, we know that that's not a possibility, because one Beit Din's takanot cannot be overturned by another Beit Din unless it's either a higher level Beit Din or has more authority, and yet the Anshe Knesset Agdolah was the highest authority. So it must mean then that they had this in mind when they established the takana of Purim in the very first place. So Elapshita Kulu Anshe Knesset Agdolah Takinu Hecha Ramiza. So where was their source in the Megillah that would give them the license to come up with this takana that it could extend to the 11th, 12th, and 13th as well? So the Gemara is going to give two explanations. Two suggestions from the Megillah. Amar Rav Shemin bar Abba Amar Rav Yochanan Amar Kra lekayem et yemei Purim ha'ele bismanehem zmanim harbe tiknu lehem, because the pasuk at the end of the Megillah says to establish Purim bismanehem. So that's in the plural, so it's mashma that there were many times that we are allowed to read the Megillah. So the Gemara says Hami bayale legufe. But it's needed for itself. In other words, to tell us that there were 2 days of Purim, not 1 day of Purim. So the Gemara says, Im ken le makra zman. Then it would have only said zman, mai zmanehem, zmanim tuva. So the fact that it says zmanehem means that there were more than one time. So the Gemara says, Vakati mi bayale zmanos zelo ki zmanos zeh. But we need the Megillah to tell us that regular Purim and Shushan Purim are on 2 separate days. So then you can't use the pasuk for your drasha. So he says, no, im ken le makra zmanam. Then it should have just said plural in the sense that it's 2. Mai zmanehem, plural in the sense that it's many. Shma mina kulu. So therefore tells you that all of the things that you're trying to say, that Purim is at a set time, and that there's 2 separate times, and that then there's many times. So the Gemara says, Ema zmanim tuva. So then maybe Purim could be any day of the year. Every day's Purim, right? So he says, no, zmanehem dumya desmanam. That it has to be, the additional times have to be like the regular times, meaning mazmanam trey, avzmanehem trey. So just like the days of Purim are the 14th and the 15th, so then these advanced dates are also 2 days. So the Gemara says, Ve'ema tresar tlesar. So then that would be the 12th and the 13th then. Whoa, how do you get the 11th, right? So he says, no. As we'll see in a second, Kedamar Shmuel bar Yitzchak, Yud Gimel Zman Ki La Lakoli, V'lo Tzarech Lirbuye. Hachanami Yud Gimel Zman Ki La Lakoli, V'lo Tzarech Lirbuye. Since the Iker miracle, as Rashi explains, of Purim was on the 13th, where they won the battle against their enemies, both inside and outside Shushan, throughout the kingdom, and the main miracle of Purim was performed on the 13th, that they survived that date and defeated their enemies. So that date, you wouldn't need anybody to give you a license to celebrate Purim on that date. So when we said that we've gotten license to add 2 more days to Purim, we mean the 11th and the 12th, because the 13th is automatically Purim, and then the 14th and 15th are the days that are the regular days to read the Megillah. So that gives us all of our days. So the Gemara asks, Ve'ema shitzar v'shivtzar, but sometimes it would be more convenient to push it to later, to the 16th and 17th. So if you have 2 days, why don't you make it after Purim? He says, V'lo yavor k'tiv, because it says that it can't go beyond, so therefore if there's any days, they're advanced days as opposed to postponed days. Okay.
It doesn't refer to Tanis Esther, though. Is that assumed to be prior to?
Yeah. Well, remember, the Tanit Esther is a much later institution, because the Tanit of Esther took place during Pesach time, not Purim time. But we've seen, like we saw here, that Tanit Esther, we sometimes, when Purim say is Sunday, we push it back from Saturday to Thursday. We saw that concept came from here. So we've borrowed a little along that concept, but Tanit Esther wasn't really in the discussion here. So the Gemara now brings another source, a second source. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Kra Kayamim asher nachu bahem hayudim. Yamim kayamim lerabot Yud Aleph Yud Bet. So he says, like the days that the Jews rested from their enemies. So it's mashma that there are some days that are like the days that they rested. So that means that there's some additional days. Ve'ema tresar tlesar. So then if you're saying that it's Yamim, which is 2, then it should be the 12th and the 13th. So he gives the same answer he gave a second ago. Marab Shimon bar Yitzchak, Yud Gimel Zman Ki La Lakoli, V'lo Tzarech Lirbuye, because the 13th was the Iker miracle. So it's the 11th and 12th that we're adding. Ve'ema Shivtzar V'Shivtzar, maybe it's the 16th, 17th. Lo Yavorti, we said that it can't be beyond Purim. Okay, so now the Gemara is curious as to why we've got 2 sets of drashas here. Why can't we agree on where the drasha is? So the Gemara asks Rabbi Shimon bar Nachmani, who's the second opinion, Ma'itama lo amar mi bizmanehem. Why doesn't he use the first drasha? So he answers very simply, Zman zmanam zmanehem lo mashmalei. It sounds to him like you're just splitting hairs, so he doesn't see any drasha there. Rab Shemin bar Abba Maitam Belomar Mi Kiyamim. So why doesn't the first person use the second drasha? Amar lachahu lidoro turichtiv. That's just to tell you that Purim is on two separate days forever. It's not talking about adding extra days. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana. Okay, so now the Gemara goes on to something new. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Zudi re Rabbi Akiva stimta. The opinion being expressed in our Mishnah about these extra days is Rabbi Akiva, who's the author of our Stam Mishnah. Darish zman zmanam zmanihem, because he learns of that drasha. V'chachamim omrim en korninota ela bizmana, that it can only be read in its proper time on the 14th or 15th. There are no advanced dates. So Meitve, so we challenge this right away. Amar Rabbi Yehuda qualified our Mishnah. Matai, when is this true? Bizman shashanim ketiknan v'yisrael shruim alad matan. This is true when the years are normal and the Jewish people lives on its land. So in other words, like there's Jewish government and people know what's going on and everything. But today, when we don't have Kiddush HaChodesh and it's not clear exactly what's going on, then you can't do this, because then people will think that that day that they're hearing the Megillah is really Purim, is really Yud Daled, and then they'll count and celebrate Pesach based on that, and there'll be all kinds of confusion. So to eliminate confusion, they got rid of this at some point. So the Gemara asks a simple question: Rabbi Yehuda liba deman. Who's Rabbi Yehuda qualifying here? Ilema liba de Rabbi Akiva afilu bisman hazeh ita lahaita kanta. If it's Rabbi Akiva that he's coming to qualify, Rabbi Akiva disagrees and holds that this takana was made for all times. Ela lava liba de Rabbanan. And so he must be qualifying the Rabbanan. But if it's the Rabbanan that he's explaining, then the Rabbanan by definition are suggesting that this is true in a time where, times are normal and it would work. So Tiyuvta Rabbi Yochanan Tiyuvta. So this schlags up Rabbi Yochanan that suggested that they never had this takana. Ikadamri, some say it was the discussion went the opposite way. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan Zudi re Rabbi Akiva stimta. This is Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Of Chachamim Amru bizman hazeh oil mistakalima and korinota ela bizmana. But the Chachamim held that now in this day and age it doesn't work anymore because people get too confused with the calendar. So Tanya Nami Hachi. So then what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is supporting this. Amar Rabbi Yehuda imatai bizman shashanim tiknav yisrael shurim al matan Rabbi bizman hazeh oil mistaklim ba and korinota ela bizmana. Rabbi Yehuda is corroborating exactly what the Chachamim are saying. Very good. Okay, so now the Gemara just points out, like in parentheses, Rav Ashi Kashyaled Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Ashi pointed out a stira between what Rabbi Yehuda is saying here in this Braita and what Rabbi Yehuda is saying in the next Mishnah. And umukim la lebraita Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, he held that the Braita was authored by Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. So the discussion went like this: Umi amar Rabbi Yehuda bizman hazeh oil mistaklim ba in korinota ela bizmana. Who says that Rabbi Yehuda says that today it doesn't work anymore because it will cause too much confusion? Or mini, I'll show you that's not true. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, this is off of the next Mishnah. Matai makom shenichnasim b'sheni v'chamishi, makom she'en nichnasim b'sheni v'chamishi, ein korinot ela bizmana. When is this allowable? It's when these particular villages actually go into the city on the Monday and the Thursday. Then they have a license to read the Megillah early. But if they really don't go to that city on Monday and Thursday, and they don't have set days where they're going there in any case, then they would read the Megillah on their normal day, because there's no reason to give them this advanced date. But in any case, you're saying but you see from what he's saying that if they really do go to the villages on Monday and Thursday, then they do have this license to advance the date. So he just said a second ago we don't do it anymore because it's too confusing, and now he's saying that we still do it as long as they really are going there. So umukim la lebraita Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore he explains that the Braita was authored by Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. So Gemara asks the obvious question: Mishum lekashile de Rabbi Yehuda mukim la lebraita Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. I don't understand. There's hundreds of places in Shas where we have a stira between Rabbi Yehuda quoted in one place, Rabbi Yehuda quoted in another place. So we're going to use a convenience excuse that maybe one of them isn't really Rabbi Yehuda, it's really Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, like his son. So why would you do that? That's ridiculous. So the Gemara answers the following: Rav Ashi shamiale de ika de tanelak Rabbi Yehuda ve'ika de tanelak Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, because Rav Ashi heard some people that quoted this Braita in the name Rabbi Yehuda, and some people that quoted in the name of his son, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, umidekashila de Rabbi Yehuda, since he had this stira between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda, so then he came to the conclusion, Amar mandetanilak Rabbi Yehuda lav davka, that the ones that are quoting it in the name Rabbi Yehuda are obviously mistaken, and mandetanilak Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda davka, and that the ones that are quoting that it was Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda must be more correct. And that way he was able to avoid the stira. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to try and establish, look at this concept that there's a concept of Shushan Purim and that it applies to walled cities from the time of Yoshua. So there's really two issues they're trying to deal with here. One is, where does the concept of having two separate days of Purim come from? Although we would seem to know the answer. That's right out of the Megillah itself. And then second of all, what does the walls from the day of Yoshua ben Nun have to do with anything? Because what does that have to, how does that have any bearing on the story of Purim? So the Gemara says, Krachim amukafim choma mimot Yoshua ben Nun korim b'chamisha asar v'chule. Okay, so minahani mili, how do we know that that's the case? So he answers, because we see that the Megillah says clearly that there was one day of battle outside of Shushan, and then they celebrated Purim on the 14th, and there were 2 days of battle in Shushan, and the Jews only rested on the 15th. So then the Megillah goes on and says that there's essentially 2 days of Purim. So he says, Mide prazim barba asar mukafim b'chamisha asar. And therefore, since the unwalled cities celebrate Purim on the 14th, the walled cities would celebrate it on the 15th. So the Gemara goes through a series of questions now to isolate that this is really the case. Be'ema prazim barba asar mukafim klal lo. Maybe it's suggesting that they celebrated Purim on the 14th outside of Shushan, and that otherwise Purim wasn't celebrated at all. So the Gemara says, "V'lav Yisrael ninu," what the other Jews that lived in Shushan and other walled cities were not Jews. V'od mihodu v'kush ktiv. It says clearly that it was celebrated everywhere in the kingdom. So he says, okay, I meant like this: Ve'ema prazim bar beisar mukafim bar beisar ubechamesar. Okay, that's the answer. So he says maybe it's that they celebrated Purim for 1 day outside of Shushan, and in Shushan they celebrated for 2 days. So he answers no. Yom 14 lechodesh Adar ve'et Yom 15 bo bechol shana. It says that this Purim was celebrated on the 14th of Adar and on the 15th of Adar. And ihavi katav et Yom 14 v'chamisha kidamart. If it said and Purim was celebrated on the 14th and the 15th, then it would be like you're saying, that it's suggesting that some people celebrated it for 2 days. Hashta dichtiv et Yom 14 ve'et Yom 15 ata et upasik. So when it says, and Purim was celebrated on the 14th of Adar and on the 15th of Adar, so it's mashma that they're mutually exclusive. You celebrated it on the 14th, or you celebrated it on the 15th. So the Gemara says, Hani barbasar v'hani b'chamisha, some on the 14th, some on the 15th. So it's clear that they're mutually exclusive and that there's 2 separate days of Purim, and that you only celebrate 1 day of Purim depending on where you are. So Gemara says, "Ve'ima prasim bar ba'asar mukafim yibau bar ba'asar yibau b'chamisar." But maybe what it's suggesting is that if you lived in a non-walled city, you'd celebrate it on the 14th, and if you lived in a walled city, you could choose whether to celebrate it on the 14th or the 15th. So it says, "Amar kra bizmanehem zmano shazeh lo zmano shazeh." So that's why it says bizmanehem, to tell you that they're separate days and that you can't celebrate one or the other, that each has its own set date. So the Gemara says ve'ema b'tleisar, so maybe they celebrate Purim in the walled cities on the 13th then. So the answer is Kish Shushan. No, Shushan Purim was the 15th, and now if you're celebrating Shushan Purim, it would be on the 15th. So, okay, so the Gemara says, Ashkechan Asiya Zechira Minalan. So that tells us that they just celebrated Purim by having the Suda, by having Mishloach Manot, Matanot Yevdanim. It doesn't say anything about reading the Megillah. Zechira Minalan, how do we know that the Megillah is the same day? Amar Krava Yamim Ha'elen Yizkarim V'Naasim, Itkash Zechira La'asiya. So we say that it's a package deal, that Zechira and Asiya are all coming at the same time. So the reading the Megillah is on the day that we celebrated Purim. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to point out that we've set the bar for when Shushan Purim is to cities that had a wall from the time of Yoshua, but we're going to see a Tana that holds that Yoshua is irrelevant, and that the time that we celebrate Shushan Purim is according to if there was a wall at the time of the story of Purim itself, at the time of Shushan, not at the time of anything else. So the Gemara points that out. Matanitin to Loki Haitana, our Mishnah is clearly not according to the following Tana. The Tanya Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha Omer, Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha held, Krachia mukafin chomam yimot achashvirosh korim b'chamisha asar. That only cities that had a wall at the time of Achashverosh would read on the 15th, and not other cities, not cities that had to have had the wall many, many years prior. So I guess he's saying by the time of Achashverosh there were many more walled cities, and it would be from that point. So he says, "My Tamad Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha." How does he come to that conclusion? He says, "Ki Shushan, ma Shushan mukefet chamamimot Achashverosh korim b'chamisha asar, af kol mukafot chamamimot Achashverosh korim b'chamisha asar." He's saying it's very simple. The celebration was in Shushan, and Shushan was the prototype for a walled city. So we're talking about contemporary walled cities, not from some other arbitrary point in history. So he says, "V'tana didan mai tama." So how did our Tana get suddenly Yoshua, right? So he answers, "Yalif prazi, because he learns a gzera shava between the Megillah and the beginning of Parshat Dvarim. It says, "K'tiv hachal kena yudima prazim, u'k'tiv hatam," when it's describing the Eretz Yisrael at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu as they were about to enter the land. It says, "Levad me'area prazi harbe me'od." It says that we captured from Sichon and Og many cities aside from the unwalled cities. So he learns Malal an mukafot chama mimot Yoshua bin Nun, Afkan mukafot chama mimot Yoshua bin Nun. So just like there, the Torah is talking about, the Graz Girsa is different, talking about unwalled cities or walled cities, if it's according to our Girsa. So it distinguished between walled city and unwalled cities at the time of Yoshua. So then the Megillah is also distinguishing between walled cities and unwalled cities from the time of Yoshua. So the Gemara says, "Bishlama Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha lo mar kitana didan de late prazi." I understand why Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha doesn't subscribe to this, because he doesn't learn that drasha that you just used. Elatana didan my tama lo mar Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. What's forcing our Tana to suddenly subscribe to the concept of Yoshua when he could have taken a much simpler path and used the Shushan at the time of the Megillah? So he says, "My tama d'ha le prazi prazi." I just told you because he has this drasha prazi prazi. So he says, "No, hachi kamar ela shushan davdinan kiman lo keprazim velo kemukafin." No, he says that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking you is if our Tana is set the cutoff that it had to be a walled city at the time of Yehoshua. Well, Shushan was not a walled city at the time of Yehoshua, and yet you're telling me that Shushan celebrates Shushan Purim, right? It's like a Purim drasha, right? Shushan celebrates Shushan Purim, right? So how does Shushan celebrate Shushan Purim? And not because it's called Shushan Purim. How can you call it Shushan Purim when Shushan doesn't meet your definition, right? So he says, Amar Ravav Amri Lakadi Shani Shushan Hoyel V'Nasa Ba'Nes, because Shushan was the main principal city that was involved in the nest. So then, even though it didn't meet the definition, it falls into it celebrates Shushan Purim nonetheless, as if it were a walled city from before then, because that's when it actually celebrated it. So it becomes the exception because that's exactly what happened. So he says, okay, so now I understand why there's two distinctions in the Megillah in terms of celebrating Purim, that we said Medinam Dina and Ir V'ir, like this: Medinam Dina lachalek ben mukafin chomam yimot Yoshabinu lemukafet chomam yimot Achashverosh. So Medinam Dina comes to tell you that those cities that had a wall from the time of Yehoshua celebrate Shushan Purim, but those cities that only had a wall from the time of Shushan don't celebrate Shushan Purim. And Ir V'ir nami lechalek ben Shushan l'sharei arot. And then Ir V'ir comes to tell you that despite that, Shushan is an exception and it celebrates Shushan Purim. Ela l'Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha bishman dinam dina lechalek ben Shushan l'sharei arot ela Ir V'ir lemay ata. But then, according to Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha, there's only one set of distinctions. There's only between walled cities and unwalled cities. There's no other distinction that's going on. So why do we have two distinctions that the Megillah is referring to? So he answers, when challenged, you always challenge back. So he says, Amar l'cha Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha latana dinan mi nicha kevan de'ile prazi prazi dinam dina lamali. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha says that according to you, you don't need the Megillah to tell you there's two distinctions either, because you have the drasha prazi prazi to tell you that it has to do with cities that had a wall at the time of Yehoshua. So then you only need one distinction also to add Shushan. So elakra ledrasha hu de'ata. So actually, this pasuk is coming to tell us something else. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi hu de'ata, Damar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi krach v'kol ha'samuch v'kol ha'nirai mo nidon ki krach. So this is a very interesting observation, that when we say walled city, we mean anything that's adjacent to it and anything that's seen with it. Now, usually this is interpreted to mean anything that can see it, right? So in Yerushalayim, as Yerushalayim's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, this has become a bigger issue in terms of what is considered Yerushalayim for Shushan Purim. So say, when I went to yeshiva many years ago, I went in BAYT V'Gan, you could see the old city from the highest points of BAYT V'Gan. But today you have Ramot, and you have Neve Yaakov, and you have Ma'ale Adumim, and all the other suburbs, Nebi Samuel, outside of Yerushalayim, and Har Nof. So how do these places celebrate Purim? They can't see the old city from there, and it's not adjacent, as we'll see in a second. So there are many neighborhoods in Yerushalayim now that, although they're municipally Yerushalayim or just outside Yerushalayim, that they celebrate 2 days of Purim, because it's not clear as to whether they should celebrate with Yerushalayim or not. So, so you'll see a lot of Torah that's been written on this particular definition just in the last 25 years. As Yerushalayim has gotten bigger, it's become a real halachic issue. So the Gemara defines kikrach ad kama. So what do we mean when we say kol hasamuch lo, adjacent? So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Teimer Rabbi Chia bar Abba kin Chamtan l'Tveria mil. It's like between Chamtan and Tveria, which is a mil. So that's a very small measure. That's like a kilometer. So clearly the suburbs of Yerushalayim are way more than a kilometer away from the old city, right? So he says v'lema mil. So why don't you just say mil? Why are you telling me like from one place to the other place? It says hakamashman de shiura de mil kamehave de milchamtan l'Tveria. I'm telling you so that because I'll tell you a meal and you don't know what that means. So I tell you that a meal means like from Chamtan to Tveria, so you understand that that's very close. We'll do one more small drasha of Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Teimer Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So since we mentioned Rabbi Yirmiyah, we give other statements. He says minatzpach Sofin Amru, that the concept of a Sofit letter was established by the Nevi'im. She says, V'tizbra, is that possible? V'aktiv ela mitzvot she'en navi rashai lechadesh davar me'ata. We learned that the Nevi'im aren't allowed to add things to the Torah. So how could it be the Nevi'im that established this? V'od ha'amar Rav Chisda mem v'samach shebeluchot b'nes hayomdim. Plus, we have a statement that we've seen many times that the mem, meaning a mem sofit, and the samech, since they're round letters and have nothing on the sides of them, they stood in the luchot by miracle, because if they were engraved through the luchot, then there'd be nothing holding them to the stone. They would fall out, right? So it's clear that they had a sofit even then. So he says, in mehave havu v'lo havu yadehe be'emtza teva ve'besof teva. So he's saying, yes, they did have a concept as a sofit, but they weren't certain whether the sofit is for the middle of the letter or the sofit is at the end of the letter. Like, they weren't sure whether the regular letter is regular in the middle of the word and the sofit is at the end, or vice versa. Ve'atu tzofim ve'takinu ptuchin be'emtza teva ustuim besof teva. And the prophets came along and established that the regular form of the letter is in the middle of the word and the sofit is at the end of the word. But the Gemara says that doesn't answer my initial question. Sof ela mitzvot she'navi atid lechadesh davar me'ata. So, but that doesn't explain to me how the Nevi'im had any say in this matter, because they're not supposed to establish something new. So how did they resolve it? So he says, Ela shechachum v'chazru v'yisidum. That they initially knew it, and then at some point, as the knowledge of Hebrew lessened, they forgot, and what the Nevi'im came back is established that the way we do it, which a regular letter in the middle of the word and a sofit at the end of the word, is the proper way of writing Hebrew.